Hello again. I want to put in a plug for this book, The Inklings. Humphrey Carpenter. The Inklings is the name given to that group that gathered first at Oxford, which included J.R.R. Tolkien, the writer of Lord of the Rings, C.S. Lewis, who I think you know about, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams, who is less known nowadays but was very influential Christian writer in that period of World War II and just past it. Several others too were connected with that group. We'll focus on the relationship between Owen Barfield and C.S. Lewis in this particular video because this has to do with the conversion of C.S. Lewis. He had been an atheist when they first met, that is Barfield and Lewis first met as fellow students at Oxford in 1919. Barfield was already a convinced student of Anthroposophy, which is a branch of Theosophy connected with the name of Rudolf Steiner. You might have heard of Madame Blavatsky, who gave us Theosophy, and Steiner and his group broke away from her. And Steiner had a pretty large following and a big influence in the New Age movement later. Barfield was already convinced of the truth of Steiner's teachings at this point, which meant he was a confirmed theist and a believer in the Bible, even if an unorthodox one. So this talks about the development of the dialogue between Barfield and Lewis in the years between 1919, when Lewis was still an atheist, and around 1929 to 30, when Lewis started to think things through all over again. By the beginning of September 1931, 11 years had passed since Jack Lewis, that's how his friends called him, not C.S. or Clive, since Jack Lewis had stopped being a dogmatic atheist. As long ago as 1920, his study of philosophy had led him to postulate some sort of God as the least objectionable theory, though he added, of course, we know nothing. The notion of an ultimate truth made sense to him because, as he remarked in 1924, when commenting on Bertrand Russell's free-thinking idealism, our ideas are, after all, a natural product, and there must be some objective standard, some ultimate fact to explain them. On the other hand, God still seemed a crude and nursery-like word, and for several years Lewis used other terms to describe his notion of fundamental truth. During this time, he was, like most of those who studied philosophy at Oxford in the early 1920s, still accepting the work of Hegel and his disciples. As a result, he chose Hegelian expressions such as the absolute mind or just the absolute. But when he spent the year 1924-25 teaching philosophy at University College, he discovered that this watered Hegelianism was inadequate for tutorial purposes. The notion of an unspecified absolute simply could not be made clear to his pupils. So he resorted to referring to fundamental truth as the spirit, capital S spirit, distinguishing this, though not really explaining how, from the God of popular religion, and emphasizing that there was no possibility of being in a personal relationship with this spirit. Meanwhile, he adopted a benevolent but condescending attitude to Christianity, which he said was a myth, conveying as much of the truth as simple minds could grasp. This was all very well, but among those simple minds were men whose thinking he profoundly admired in other respects: Mallory, Spencer, Milton, Donne, Herbert, Johnson, and the author whose romance fantasques he had discovered in adolescence, George MacDonald. It was annoying to love the writings of these men without being able to accept the central premise of their thought, Christianity. Moreover, many of his friends were Christians. Tolkien was a Catholic, and Greaves and Coghill were Anglicans, while Barfield, though an anthroposophist, accepted the principal ideas of Christianity. So in the company of those he most liked, Lewis was the outsider. His ideas changed again when, as a result of their Great War, Barfield managed to persuade him to accept the experience of joy as relevant to his thinking, and not to dismiss it as merely subjective emotional sensation. Joy was not a deception, he now decided. Its visitations were rather the moments of clearest consciousness we had. He was going through this stage during 1926 and 1927, The admission of something as irrational as joy into his ruthlessly logical thinking threw him into confusion. "All my ideas are in a crumbling state at present," he wrote in his diary in May 1926. He realized that he had let his rational side dominate his emotions too long, remarking in the diary, "One needn't be asking questions and giving judgments all the time." But while this realization was refreshing, he recorded in January 1927 that he was frightened of what he called the danger of falling back into the most childish superstitions, by which he presumably meant belief in God and Christianity. He still had immense resistance to the idea of returning to anything so nursery-like. 3 weeks after this, he stopped keeping a diary and never resumed, declaring that it was a foolish waste of time. It was also perhaps because he was unwilling to make public. He often read his diary to Mrs. Moore and showed it to Warney. So it was really a public document. He was unwilling to make public the sensations of the supernatural which he was now experiencing, for he had begun to feel that it was not he himself who was taking the initiative, but something outside him. As he expressed it to Owen Barfield, the spirit was showing an alarming tendency to become much more personal and is taking the offensive. One day, while going up Headington Hill on a bus, he became aware that I was holding something at bay or shutting something out. There was a choice to open the door or keep it shut. Next moment, he found that he had chosen to open it. From this, which happened in 1927 or 1928, it was only a matter of time before he admitted that God was God, a step that he finally took in the summer of 1929. It was then that he gave in and knelt and prayed. But even so, he had done no more than accept theism, a simple belief in God. He was not able to perceive the relevance of Christ's death and resurrection, and he told a friend, Jenkin, "My outlook is now definitely religious. It is not precisely Christianity, though it may turn out that way in the end." Apart from the last stage, when he admitted some kind of supernatural experience, Lewis had reached this position entirely through logical argument. Even his acceptance of joy as a factor had only been conceded after elaborate reasoning by Barfield. But now he began to realize that reasoning would not take him any further. The acceptance of God did not lead him automatically to the acceptance of Christianity. He was becoming certain that he wanted to accept it. He examined other religions but found none that was acceptable. Meanwhile, his present state of simple theism was inadequate. On the other hand, he did not know how he could argue himself into specifically Christian beliefs. Even if he were to accept the historicity of the Christian story, and he could see no particular barrier to it, he could not understand how the death and resurrection of Christ were relevant to humanity. By the time that Lewis had come to believe in God, but not yet in Christ, Owen Barfield had done something for him that would later bear fruit. He had shown Lewis that myth, capital M myth, has a central place in the whole of language and literature. Barfield's arguments were printed in his book Poetic, Diction, a short work by him that appeared in 1928, though by that time Lewis knew its ideas well. Barfield examined the history of words and came to the conclusion that mythology, far from being, as the philologist Max Muller called it, a disease of language, is closely associated with the very origin of all speech and literature. In the dawn of language, said Barfield, speakers did not make a distinction between the literal and the metaphorical, but used words in what might be called a mythological manner. For example, nowadays, when we translate the Latin spiritus, we have to render it either as spirit, or as breath, or as wind, depending on the context. But early users of language would not have made any such distinction between these meanings. To them, a word like spiritus meant something like spirit, breath, wind. When the wind blew, it was not merely like someone breathing, it was the breath of a god. And when an early speaker talked about his soul as spiritus, it did not merely mean that it was like a breath, it was to him just that, the breath of life. Mythological stories were simply the same thing in narrative form. In a world where every word carried some implication of the animate, and where nothing could be purely abstract or literal, It was natural to tell tales about the gods who rule the elements and walk the earth. This, in greatly simplified form, is what Barfield argued in Poetic Diction. He was not the only person to come to this conclusion. For example, in Germany, Ernst Cassirer had said much the same thing independently. But it was said with particular force by Barfield, and his book impressed not just Lewis, but also Tolkien. Not long after the book's publication, Lewis reported to Barfield, "You might like to know that when Tolkien dined with me the other night, he said, apropos of something quite different, that your conception of the ancient semantic unity had modified his whole outlook, and that he was always just going to say something in a lecture when your conception stopped him in time." It's one of those things, he said, that when you've once seen it, there are all sorts of things you can never say again. Perhaps it was as a result of reading Barfield's book that Tolkien made an inversion of Muller's remark. Languages, he declared, are a disease of mythology. So it was that by 1931, Lewis had come to understand that mythology has an important position in the history of thinking. It was a realization that helped him cross his last philosophical hurdle. So next time, from God to Christianity, or from God to Christ. So that will be the section where it deals more explicitly with the influence of Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. Put in a link to Vivian's series on Mere Christianity.